the first country to organize a national action against TTIP. This is amazing.
Hands off the NHS! Hands off public education!
It's the biggest bilateral trade deal ever negotiated, and it's going to cover more than 40% of current global GDP.
If you care about the NHS, you must join with us to stop TTIP. If you care about stopping climate change, you must join with us to stop TTIP. If you want to regulate the big banks and take control of them, you must stop TTIP.
TTIP, no way!
TTIP's an abdication of political decision-making and a promotion of corporate decision-making.
Today is just the beginning. We will keep together to form a new world where we wipe out the scourge of corporate power. This is what TTIP's about, and defeating TTIP, we begin to defeat the rule of the 1%. Thank you so much for coming out.
On both sides of the Atlantic, under the EU-US trade agreement, TTIP, there is a plan to harmonise rules for how products are made and sold. It's called regulatory coherence. Now, that may sound like the most boring, abstract technical term you've ever heard, but it will have very real consequences on our lives. Consequences that could be amazing, but that will actually be terrible, unless you're a big corporation. But first, let's see what kind of rules exist on both sides. Take the way the animals we eat are treated, for instance. In the US, the focus is on the end product. As long as what ends up on your plate doesn't kill you, it doesn't matter how it got there. In the EU, the focus is more on the animal's welfare and quality of life, until it ends up on your plate. Now take medical devices like hip implants. The US has much stricter rules than the EU. By raising EU standards up to the US ones, we could have the best prosthetics. So as we can see, people in the EU and the US could gain a lot from sharing their best standards. But here's the trick. So far, the agreement has not been written for people, but for big corporations. They're the ones setting the agenda. They want to make more profit by lowering the costly standards and regulations here and in the US. With this logic, no matter what side of the Atlantic you're on, you get screwed equally.
A giant free trade agreement is currently being negotiated between the European Union and the US government. Hidden within this deal are plans to include rules to give investors the right to sue governments. Many fear their inclusion presents a grave threat to democracy, public funds, and the development of public policy. These rules, officially known as investor-state dispute settlement clauses, are found in many international trade and investment agreements, mostly signed since the 1990s. They give investors based in a country where the agreement was made the ability to sue another signatory state if its policies have resulted in reduced profits. Investors are increasingly using these clauses to sue governments for billions of dollars. In 2012, 58 new claims were filed against states, the highest number ever filed in 1 year.
Foreign investors and their lawyers and law firms are becoming more and more creative at the kinds of government decisions that they're attacking. 15 years ago, there were virtually no awards and very few cases. And now there are several hundred. That's a very large number in the context of international law and international adjudication. Investors are suing on a whole range of government policies. American tobacco giant Philip Morris is suing Uruguay for $2 billion over health warnings on cigarette packs. Swedish energy firm Vattenfall is seeking over 3.7 billion euros from Germany because of a decision to phase out nuclear power following the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. And Canadian mining company Lone Pine is using a US subsidiary to sue the Canadian government for $250 million after Quebec placed a moratorium on fracking over environmental concerns.
It could be that all these actions have got a freezing effect on policy discretion, that states do no longer want to run the risk of doing things that displease investors.
Sometimes the mere threat of an investor-state dispute can be enough to kill legislation just because the policymaker is afraid of being sued. So that shows that investor-state disputes are actually also an enormous threat to our democracy.
Both the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund have warned that investor rights in trade agreements can severely curb a state's ability to respond in times of financial crisis.
When a country is in an economic crisis, it needs to adapt all kinds of measures to get out of the crisis and also to protect its people from the worst.
During Greece's recent economic crash, the government was forced to eliminate a portion of its debt by writing down its government bonds. Hedge funds, banks and other investors lost parts of their investment, and now some investors are suing.
If any investors win on the basis of a bilateral investment treaty, this will open the floodgates to thousands upon thousands of other claims.
Greece remains in a state of crisis, with the population facing job losses, wage cuts and public service closures.
One can imagine that if this fiscal gap is broadened by having to pay out millions upon millions of euros in compensation to investors, then it's going to become even more difficult and more painful for the population to find the funds to address these issues.
Το δικαίωμα που δίνεται στους ξένους επενδυτές να μπορέσουν να μηνύσουν το κράτος για τη χασούρα που έχουν τέλος πάντων, ναι, νομίζω ότι είναι πολύ άδικο. Ένα κράτος πρέπει πρώτα να φροντίζει τους δικούς του πολίτες, να φροντίζει για την υγεία, για την παιδεία. Ίσως δεν ξέρω σε χρήμα τι έχουν και εμάς η κρίση μας χτύπησε σχεδόν από την αρχή την οικογένειά μου. Ας έχουν και αυτοί λίγη χασούρα.
Investor-state disputes can be a severe burden for public budgets, taking away money that should rather go into education or the funding of hospitals.
Investor arbitration creates a separate legal system that allows investors to bypass national courts and bring their cases before an arbitration panel at tribunals such as ICSID.
It's perfectly possible that, for example, Vattenfall loses its case in the German Constitutional Court, that the National Court in Germany says, well, the way that Germany got out of nuclear power was perfectly fine, but Vattenfall wins its parallel claim at an international arbitration tribunal, and that this tribunal actually says, yes, you get 3.7 billion euros in compensation just because the German government got out of nuclear energy.
Investor-state arbitration is not fair for a very specific reason. Only the companies can sue governments. It's a game in which the governments only get to play defense. Do the arbitrators not have an economic incentive to favor the claimants? Because if more claims come, the arbitrators will be appointed more and more. These processes, they're not independent, they're not open, they're not procedurally fair, they're not balanced, and they're not democratically accountable.
Big business on both sides of the Atlantic is lobbying for investor-state arbitration clauses to be included in the EU-US trade deal. In a letter to US negotiators, the energy giant Chevron writes that investor-state protection is one of our most important issues globally.
If there is inclusion of an investor-state arbitration clause within a major deal, like an US-EU deal, the signal it gives to the market is that investor rights are paramount. This is problematic. The more we create legal mechanisms that put the investors at ease, the more we risk taking away huge chunks of economic decision-making away from the hands of the people that ought to have a say in how their lives are run.
Investor-state dispute settlement is dangerous, period. But I would say that because of the tremendous amount of corporations that are incorporated both in the United States and the European Union, the liability for both goes up dramatically.
This is not a technical issue. It would set a gold standard for investment agreements. This would have dire consequences for citizens. I mean, it's us paying for these lawsuits with our money, and we're talking millions.
EU-US negotiators should actually dump investor-state arbitration from their negotiation agenda. It should not be included in a future deal. If they include it, environmental organizations, trade unions, public health groups have already announced that they will do everything to define this attack on democracy and policies to protect the public interest.
not only because of Obama's visit, but also because of Obama's visit, we wanted that people pay attention to risk in this TTIP or trade negotiations in between the United States and EU. We fear that especially all green achievements in European regulations, high standards for consumer protection, high standards against GMOs, high environmental standards, high standards for social affairs and labor, are at risk if they continue to negotiate like they started.
After the economic collapse, we were looking for where do you go for more growth? And trade is, of course, a big part of that. And we looked and we thought, you know what? Our biggest, best trading relationship can actually be even better. Let's go there.
We're talking about what could be the biggest bilateral trade deal in history.
The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, also known as TTIP.
A deal that will have a greater impact than all the other trade deals on the table put together.
Shaping the way we work and the way we live our daily lives.
We intend to move forward fast. We can say that neither of us will give up content for the sake of speed, but we intend to make rapid progress.
This is a once-in-a-generation prize, and we are determined to seize it.
We'll find solutions to thorny issues. We'll keep our eyes on the prize, and we'll succeed.
We give America pizza, they give us Domino's. We give them Beaujolais, they give us Pepsi Max. We give them Gerard Depardieu, and they give us Angelina Jolie.
Trade isn't always balanced, but free trade has its benefits, even if we don't like everything we receive.
TTIP, first and foremost, is intended to take away barriers in what is already a huge flow of goods traded and investments crossing the ocean. And so if we can simplify the bureaucratic process, take away barriers for our small, medium-sized enterprises and companies, this helps develop economic growth and jobs.
Very few people realize that this would be the first congressionally ratified treaty between the United States and the European Union. It's not just an economic deal, it's more than that. It's geostrategic.
At the heart of the deal is a desire to boost trade and harness geopolitical forces which can resist the rise of China. European Trade Commissioner Karel de Gucht has led Europe's trade portfolio with a clear position that open markets make for a better society. De Gucht is admired by arch-free marketeers, but he's seen by the socialists, and especially the far left, as the godfather of dark monetary forces.
The EU side is negotiating with the US. The US have the documents, they've seen the documents, they've spied on the whole thing. And the EU public hasn't seen any of the documents, the MEPs haven't seen any of the documents, and so you see how unequal those negotiations are.
The problems with TTIP are manifold. It starts with an obvious lack of transparency about what is actually being discussed. Only part of the European Parliament is actually being consulted.
The only people with participation in the trade talks are the unelected European Commission, led by De Gucht.
For many on the left, the Gucht father is keeping all the cash for a chosen few. They see him protecting the capitalist family. For Commissioner de Gucht, like Don Corleone before him, he's simply making them an offer they won't refuse. And like Don Corleone, he doesn't like to share information.
The Parliament is meant to have some degree of oversight, but for example, I wrote yesterday seeking the latest documents. They aren't available to us. They're only available to a very select number of MEPs.
The Parliament will have to vote on the deal as a whole, but most of the MEPs don't see what's being discussed.
A lot of MEPs are becoming increasingly concerned about the lack of transparency in the process. How should this be addressed?
Well, we should be, of course, opening all the mandates, all the proceedings. I'm for full transparency. I would appreciate if the Council would do that, because it's up to them. We in the Parliament know much more about it than we did in former negotiations, but it would be very helpful if the Council would not stick to their secret policy.
If I'm very mild, I must say for the Commission is a completely new situation. I work with the Commission since 25 years, and I would say from one mandate to the other, each 5 years, they had to come a little bit lower from their high towers in which they were. And now they have really to communicate with us. And they don't know exactly how to do it.
I want to reassure you. We Commission, the European Commission, are negotiating on behalf of all the 28 member states. We received a clear mandate. We are going to respect it fully. And of course, our mandate does not allow for any kind of, let's say, weakening of our standards.
The Commission pretends to listen now. It has started a large PR offensive to appear transparent and also listening to the wider public. But we don't see that the concerns that we and other civil society groups have about this agreement are really picked up in the negotiation agenda.
Which individuals are driving the agenda?
For the DG Trade, it's really the Commissioner himself, the TTIP negotiating team, and clearly they have very regular interactions with business lobby groups. Not long ago, Corporate Europe Observatory showed that there is privileged access for business in these negotiations.
Civil society, trade unions, environmental groups, they don't get that kind of access, and so it's massive disparity.
More than 90% of the meetings that the Commission organized to prepare the talks took place with lobbyists from companies and corporate lobby groups. When the negotiations were announced in February 2013, not a single meeting had happened with a trade union or an environmental organization or consumer groups.
A couple of weeks ago, the chief negotiator on the EU side had lunch one day with the Transatlantic Business Council, which brings together big business on both sides of the Atlantic. And then with, I think it was Business Europe, another business lobbying organization, he had dinner the next night.
The negotiations are a package, and they're underway. And in the end, the Parliament is supposed to give its opinion on the whole result of the negotiations.
Parliament's role is to approve a deal once it's been concluded. So the Commission's got to negotiate it. I know the negotiators here, they're going to do a good job. The Council's going to have to authorize the signature. They're not going to authorize the signature unless they think it's a good agreement. And when we go to Parliament, when the EU goes to the Parliament and says, this is the agreement we have, I don't think they'll have too much problem convincing the parliamentarians that it's worthwhile.
The European Parliament has only one right in trade policy, and that is to either accept or reject the negotiations at the very end. So when you have several hundreds of pages of a very technical treaty, they won't be able to say, well, we're in favor, but we have a problem with that chapter. So it's really, there's very meager democratic control.
There's nothing new in trade deals, but many observers on both sides of the Atlantic are deeply concerned that corporate giants are squeezing consumers with a liberalisation of trade which weakens consumer protection, undermines environmental standards and strikes the pocketbook of the European and American everyman.
The issues of regulatory cooperation and regarding investment protection, or ISDS in particular, maybe are the tools to say, well, we have concerns about TTIP in general because it will impact on our daily lives.
I would say the biggest threat to democracy in TTIP comes from the far-reaching rights that it will grant to foreign investors to sue governments. And we have seen investors around the world using lawsuit threats to actually fight democratic policy making. Yeah, increasingly. I mean, there are more than 500 cases that have been filed by investors against governments. That is a very high number for international law.
They would give the rights of corporations to sue states for implementing regulations in the interest of ordinary people.
Which would put clearly a pressure on states and their right to regulate.
Business Europe strongly supports investment protection under TTIP and is open to look at the investor-to-state dispute settlement issue and how it can be improved. It's a system that has evolved over time, and we can see that there is a lot of criticism on this. We're open to look at these issues, to find solutions that can address the concerns that have been raised, particularly by civil society.
There are going to be sensitivities on both sides. There are going to be politics on both sides. But if we can look beyond the narrow concerns to stay focused on the big picture, the economic and strategic importance of this partnership, I'm hopeful we can achieve the kind of high standard, comprehensive agreement that the global trading system is looking to us to develop.
We have to distinguish between facts and fears. We have to get an informed debate, and I think the Commission's consultation is a very good initiative to put the facts on the table to show, well, this is what we aim for.
Of course, one group finds this more important or another group something else. But at this moment, we don't know the contents of TTIP. A lot of my colleagues are saying we don't want it. But what don't we want? There is no concrete content. We will look at the contents, and when we have looked at them, then we can say, yes, we accept this or we don't accept it.
Ultimately, all of these things will have to be subjected to scrutiny in the light of day. But no point in getting excited about potential provisions in trade agreements that haven't been drafted yet.
Right now, people don't know. They know that there's this big negotiation going on between the United States and Europe, but they don't really know what it is. And so part of what we need to do is we need to make sure that people do know what it is.
Trade is probably better served by negotiating behind closed doors. But democracy doesn't prosper in the dark. So there is a wider issue, bigger than this trade deal. It's about our capacity to trust our governments. In the back of a Parisian taxi, posters slammed TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership currently being negotiated between Brussels and Washington. The taxi driver explained why TTIP was going to crush the poor, weaken democracy, and give even more power to global corporations. When we got out of the taxi, Fernando gave us leaflets about the campaign to stop TTIP. Whether you agree with Fernando or not, this is democracy in action. The people do have a voice, even if they are not well represented at the negotiating table. But what is interesting is that direct action is not spreading across Europe in the way that it's caught the imagination in France. For many Europeans, TTIP is just another trade deal, but it isn't.
We're talking about what could be the biggest bilateral trade deal in history.
The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, also known as TTIP.
A once-in-a-generation prize, and we are determined to seize it.
The European economy is bigger than the American one. So this is a negotiation between equals that have an equal interest in an ambitious outcome of the negotiation.
A lot of citizens have concerns. They fear that standards for environment protection or consumer protection might be at stake.
Our publics, both in Europe and the United States, have legitimate questions when it comes to trade deals as to whether or not it's going to benefit their countries over the long term, and can we make sure that hard-won victories around consumer protection or environmental protection are preserved as opposed to weakened.
We have to look very carefully at principles that we adhere to, that we believe in, and that are fundamental to us in Europe, and to see how we can combine that with the opportunities that are inevitably there. At the end of the day, we should be able to come to a win-win agreement, but of course my interest is to make the European side win most.
Competition is a good thing, but not if you lose.
So the losers are those who care about GMOs, who don't want GM food here. The losers are those who care about the quality of our food, chlorine-washed chicken, hormone-fed beef. The losers are all those who would benefit from regulation, because what's going to happen is they're going to have regulatory convergence. Does anyone believe they're going to converge things upwards, that we're going to have higher labour standards, higher environmental standards? Clearly we're not.
I cannot see what the problem is there. Of course, there are a number of differences between the EU and the US, and they will pertain, they will continue. But on the other hand, they are about the closest to us that you can imagine, no? So take, for example, labor standards. I can see that this is a big worry when you discuss with developing countries or when you discuss with emerging economies, but both the EU and the US are mature economies. So I can't see that this would be the dividing issue.
I think the Commission's Trade Department sees itself as a service provider for the European industry to open markets abroad. That's actually what the Trade Commissioner told me as his job description. They don't even think about that this will have an effect on labor rights or the environment or our climate. So it is in their understanding to act for European industry.
Do you want to take, here are my rules in Europe for protecting people for cars. And here are the US rules. What you want to do is you want to see if you can build a bridge between those two sets of rules. Right now, in order to meet the standards of safety required in Europe and in the United States, you have to crash hundreds of cars. And these cars are prototypes, so they're very expensive, much more expensive than when they're coming off the factory line. And you have to crash them. If you're a smaller manufacturer, the idea of doing 100 car crashes for European rules and then 100 car crashes for American rules makes it prohibitive. You just don't even think of offering that car. There are things like that that come in literally every area of our economies. Agriculture is an area where we often have a lot of different problems, often related to food safety concerns. Not that the food is less safe, but that our food safety regulators actually look at things differently.
We in Europe feel very strongly about the precautionary principle. So first knowing whether a product is safe to enter the market before allowing it onto the market, where the Americans think that this is too conservative and they prefer to just allow goods in the market until a problem is occurring.
One of the sore points for people, particularly on the left, is that consumer standards will be lowered by TTIP. They cite chlorinated chicken, dipping the chicken in chlorine to kill bacteria.
It's quite a big stake for American industry who want us to import this kind of chicken. And I've heard that the Commissaire of Trade would like Europe to also welcome chicken that are treated with chlorine. There's no point using this kind of disinfectant. It's like antibiotics. If you use too many antibiotics, then they are not useful, they are not efficient when you need them.
There is a lot of, I wouldn't even call it gossip, because it's said very openly that is not correct. For example, you still have a number of politicians saying that we are going to import hormone beef. That's simply not true. And the best proof is that we have made an agreement with Canada, and Canada gets a quota for beef. Well, it will have to be hormone-free beef. No? We are not going to change our SPS standards. We are not going to do that. But it seems to me that this is part of the political capital of a number of politicians, and that's why they continue, in fact, telling lies about this.
Speaking with Commissioner de Gucht, it's impossible to doubt his sincere belief that TTIP is about a long-term plan for Europe's economy. It's not about adding another percentage point or two to GDP this year or next year.
The energy discussion is a very interesting one. Of course, now United States seeking to become energy independent. And the impact that that will have on our industries and on our cooperation. The last word hasn't been said about it. What's important for us is that we also have environmental standards in Europe that are very important. And one could say the precautionary principle also applies to shale gas, for example.
People think that we have no access to shale gas. That's not true. A lot of European companies, major companies, have licenses to export shale gas. Now, the big difference if we make this agreement with the US would be that this is legally certain for the future, because it would be in the treaty as such, this access to shale gas.
Once we have a trade agreement in place, export licenses for liquefied natural gas destined to Europe would be much easier. Something that's obviously relevant in today's geopolitical climate.
Energy independence for Europe is a key topic in and of itself. And so if that can be sparked by TTIP or by global affairs like the crisis around Crimea and tensions with Russia, it is actually only a reminder of how important our cooperation is politically, economically, and how we need to redefine the transatlantic relation for the next generation.
The Commission always is promising us, when we are asking about it, that the standards will be not lowered. We are keeping our standards. The question is how.
How will regulations and laws be harmonized in the future between the US and the EU, so post the agreement? And we see from the proposals that have been leaked from the Commission that these will provide many avenues for business to intervene very early in the democratic policy process to weaken, postpone or even kill legislation.
There's no one who thinks that you can use an agreement like this to, quote, lower regulation. It's just not going to work. That's why we have parliaments in a democracy system. They're not going to. Trade negotiators would love to think that they're all powerful, but they know they're not.
It's up to us parliamentarians to talk to the citizens and to make things clear. Also countering this overemphasis of the benefits, but also countering these very primitive anti-positions of some NGOs and some parties. I think serious discussions of the benefits, of the problems, that is necessary, and that's up to Euro parliamentarians to be objectively part of that debate.
Sometimes I have the feeling that a number of NGOs would like to be on my right hand and left hand side when I'm negotiating. No, that's not realistic either. I'm not hiding anything, but on the other hand, you need some degree of confidentiality when you negotiate. You cannot negotiate in the open. No? You can discuss in the open in Parliament and vote in the Parliament, yes, but negotiate in the open, that has never happened before. And I think it would not succeed, by the way.
When we speak with lobby groups on the left, it's clear they're motivated, organized, and very often opposed to any kind of trade deal, which leaves the quieter majority in the middle. Is their silence a sign of acquiescence, that they trust the good father and those leading Europe's trade policy, or is it a sign that TTIP is too complex and too far removed from their everyday reality? TTIP cannot be all things to all people, but it can be the strong foundation for a future European economy. It will only survive as a useful trade platform if it demonstrates fairness, respect for democracy and accountability. In the end, TTIP may be an offer we can refuse, but ultimately, we have to take care of business.
I'm Manuel Perez Rocha from the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and I'm here in Brussels to attend the first strategy meeting on the Transatlantic and Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, between the European Union and the United States. The governments of the US and the EU are negotiating this trade agreement behind doors, and it's very important that we know what is happening here.
DG Trade, for many years, they're not only fighting for European industry. This is really an institution, a state apparatus that fights for transnational capital. They've always done that, and they were very active in encouraging EU industry to team up with their US counterparts when they put forward their first position papers on TTIP. So this is really an agent of transnational capital.
Business groups and the governments are trying hard to convince us that the TTIP is good for job creation, for the environment, and for people in general.
A year and a half ago, we were not even sure the place had a door, and now we are entering the negotiating room together. It's a sign of the strong political will on both sides. It shows the political will to work together with our long-standing and most trusted partner on the essential objective for governments on either side of the Atlantic: growth, jobs, and prosperity. Together, Europe and the United States are the backbone of the world economy. Opening up that space further for opportunities for business and consumers is simply common sense. And that's why we are impatient to start, although we know that negotiations won't be a smooth ride. Obviously, there are and will be sensitive issues on each side. With flexibility, open-mindedness, and some creativity, the greatest asset for negotiators and statesmen, I'm confident we will find solutions. There is too much at stake. The launch of our negotiations, therefore, stands for our continued common commitment to engage with each other in order to engage with the world. The EU and its member states are ready to engage and look forward to the new trade landscape we will shape together.
However, despite the rhetoric of the negotiators, the TTIP would have huge implications in many aspects of our lives, from food sovereignty to digital rights to privileges given to investors, to the environment, labor rights, and indeed for the rest of the world.
The reason we're most concerned about TTIP is its potential to undermine the progress in rebuilding local food systems, both in the United States and in Europe. In the US, we have all this amazing activity on the ground where people are trying to produce without GMOs, produce food that's healthier, building programs where they sell directly in local markets, or they farm-to-school programs that get healthy, locally grown foods into schools. And we're concerned that specifically the procurement commitments in TTIP could undermine that. We also work with groups trying to label GMOs, for example, or get toxics out of the food system. There are active campaigns all across the country trying to do that at the state level, and many of those people look to Europe for inspiration. They see the kinds of laws in Europe, they know about the use of the precautionary principle, they know about REACH on chemical reform, and see that aspire to that kind of system. And so those people too are angry about what this could mean. So we're still in this initial phase of trying to help people understand what the impacts could be, but there's a lot of new energy around it.
Well, the biggest U.S. online companies, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, see the Transatlantic Partnership, TTIP, as a way to expand all the data that they collect on citizens and consumers all over the world, including in the EU. So the TTIP threatens to unleash greater commercial surveillance of citizens in the EU. It will provide a new mechanism for the NSA and other intelligence agencies to gain information about what we do and to make actions about that information. And it will further place the internet under the control of the most powerful corporations.
Their concern is about access to knowledge, access to content, which concerns the copyright. There is the fear that TTIP might become like ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, and internet service providers might actually have to block access to content simply because the content industry, right holders, the music industry, or the Hollywood studios might ask them to do so because they might think that consumers are infringing copyright by downloading movies for their personal use.
TTIP would remove the ability of governments and communities to put in place policies that protect our climate. And one example is the EU, for example, has a new proposal that will actually expand trade in dangerous fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas from the US to the European Union, while actually restricting the ability of governments and communities to put in place clean energy programs. The EU is looking to import more fracked gas from the United States. And as you may know, fracking is the incredibly dangerous process of drilling deep into the ground, injecting millions of gallons of water, undisclosed chemicals, sand in the ground in order to crack shale rock and release natural gas. And it's a process that has incredible health implications and implications for our global climate. Another serious implication of the agreement would be to empower corporations to challenge environment and climate policies. So one of the chapters of TTIP is likely to be on investment. And what this would do is give foreign corporations the right to directly challenge and actually essentially sue governments over laws and policies that are designed to protect our environment and climate. And because I was just talking a little bit about fracking, just to give one example of a case that's now ongoing that could be sort of replicated and expanded in TTIP. That I'd mention the case of Lone Pine Resources, which is a US energy firm that is now suing Canada under NAFTA's investment chapter for $250 million for one reason, and that is because the government of Quebec put in place a simple time-out or moratorium on fracking in order to understand the environmental implications of fracking for oil and gas underneath the St. Lawrence River.
This is not the first trade and investment agreement. There is a famous example of this kind of trade agreements, which is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was concluded in 1994. And the conclusions about NAFTA is that it was very bad for the workers in the United States, but in the other countries too. NAFTA has also weakened the labor standards in the United States and in Mexico. In fact, it's creating strengthened competition between the countries. it raises the profits of big companies, but it doesn't improve the living and working conditions of workers.
Our focus currently is on the investor-state arbitration system. It's going to be part of the TTIP, the EU-US agreement, probably also of the CETA agreement. And we think it's a very dangerous, in fact scandalous, system that is being set up on behalf of global capital, of corporations, of international investors that want to attack public policies. The investor-state dispute settlement system is dangerous for public policies, for democracy, and even for national and European legal systems, because it gives corporations an extra tool to attack our democratic political decisions, court decisions, administrative practices, in a private system of tribunals that make binding decisions. These tribunals are run by arbitration lawyers that make a lot of money, so this is a business for the arbitration industry, and they decide over issues like health, like environmental, like finance or economic policy regulations. And we think it's totally misplaced to give private corporations this power to attack public regulations. It's also scandalous that this is all happening in secrecy. And it's highly questionable that this system where an arbitration industry developed to make a lot of money out of this can really undermine democratically developed sovereign decisions.
We find that we're in a specific moment, strategic moment, where first there has been a negotiation between Canada and the EU. There's an agreement in principle, which just goes deeper into what we call the corporate-led model that puts the investors' rights before the people's rights, but also the investors' rights, both and their power, both at the economic and political level. So there is like sort of a coup, right, that we're confronting, that we need to mingle up our social movements and try to confront the system at this specific venture.
If the TTIP will not bring economic, social, or environmental justice, it is then urgent to stop it. We have stopped this type of agreements before. It depends on us.
The EU and the US are on the path to creating a free trade agreement. The TTIP is expected to stimulate the economy through the standardization of legal regulations. Yet the question remains, is what is good for companies also good for us as citizens? Almost all of the advisors consulted by the negotiators represent corporate interests. The decisions being taken will have a widespread impact, reason enough to keep a sharp eye on the negotiators. Yet this is precisely what is not happening. Negotiations are taking place behind closed doors. This does not look like democracy. What is at stake? What interests are behind the planned agreement? Hormone-treated meat, cloned cattle, chlorinated chicken, and genetic engineering have taken hold in the US. The EU still prohibits all these things. Yet corporations have made their interests clear. For example, the US National Pork Producers Council has stated that it would not accept any result in which widespread hormonal therapy is still prohibited. In the US, the practice of fracking has been massively expanded to increase gas supplies. Under high pressure, a mixture of chemicals and water is compressed into the earth. This results in the contamination of drinking water and soil. The TTIP promises cheap gas exports, but at what price? And who is liable for the damage caused? Environmental groups throughout the world reject fracking. In 2010, following the financial crisis, the US gave its administrative authorities the option to regulate foreign subsidiaries of US banks. This has angered the US banking industry. Yet it has found an ally in the EU, which has called for the recognition of weaker European laws. Significant proposals regarding bank regulation are once again at stake. Achievements made on both sides of the Atlantic are at risk. Workers' rights were hard won in this part of the world. In the US, however, there are hardly any enforceable protection rights against employers. No rights for the election of works councils or for trade unions to engage in collective bargaining. These achievements would be directly threatened by opening up competition to new markets. The so-called investor-state disputes that the TTIP will enable are particularly dangerous for the state and its citizens. If a law adversely affects the profits of a corporation, it can sue the state for damages, all at the taxpayer's expense. And lawsuits are more than likely, as expected profits are negatively impacted by environmental laws, minimum wage legislation, higher taxes, or bans on individual products. What is problematic is that such complaints will not be heard before ordinary courts. So-called arbitration courts, composed of 3 attorneys, will be used, and their decisions are binding under international law. Free trade agreements can be very costly to taxpayers, as Canada is currently finding out thanks to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The US and Mexico are also signatories. The residents of Quebec voted in a referendum to protect the environment from fracking. A fracking company then sued the Canadian government for $250 million in damages. Grandiose promises of growth, prosperity, and new jobs can't be trusted either. Experts estimate that NAFTA has cost 700,000 jobs in the US and has massively increased poverty in southern Mexico. This is in stark contrast to the fine words and predictions which won people over at the time, and which we are now hearing once again. The winners of free trade agreements are solely banks and corporations. But we can still do something. Help us stop the TTIP.
Leave the past behind, just walk away. When it's over and the heart breaks and the cracks begin to show. Begin to show. Begin to show.